show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. They said, "No, but we are determined to have a king over us, so that we also may be like other nations, and that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles." When Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to their voice and set a king over them." Samuel then said to the people of Israel, "Each of you return to your home." And every so often I like to step away from the lectionary for a while and do a sermon series. And I like to do this because the Revised Common Lectionary kind of gives you the highlights instead of the whole story. The last time I did a series, at least one of you was brave enough to tell me that you liked it because it helped you understand the story in ways that you hadn't before. And if one of you is brave enough to say it, I'm sure that there are more of you out there with that experience. So for this series, I want to start with Samuel. And it's been a little while since we talked about Samuel, but he's the one who was dedicated to the service of God by his mother Hannah. Just as soon as Samuel was weaned, he was left with Eli to be raised as a priest. Samuel is the one who hears God speaking to him in the night and mistakes it for Eli's voice, resulting in a kind of comedic back and forth where he serially wakes the poor old priest up and says, "Here I am, you called?" When we last left Samuel, it turned out that he was a great prophet, and everyone recognized him for it. As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. Now in those days there was no king. When neighboring countries went to war with the tribes of Israel, a leader would sort of arise and take charge. That's what the book of Judges is primarily about. When the Philistines waged war on the tribes of Israel, Samuel became one of those leaders. And under his leadership, they defeated the Philistines and entered a time of peace. But time marches on. Things change, and not always for the better. Oh, Samuel was just as great a prophet as always, and Israel was still in a great period of peace. But Samuel was getting old, and his sons were known to take bribes. Hardly the kind of people you want in power. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came up with a plan. Unfortunately for Samuel's poor heart, the first part of that plan was to find him and say, "You're old, and your kids are no good." Ouch. the second part is basically to force him into retirement. Oh, and completely change Israel's form of government, thanks. Now, if I think about it, I can understand where the elders are coming from. Samuel's sons are not good leaders. And what will happen to Israel when Samuel dies? They'll not have the advantage of a true prophet, someone who literally hears what God is saying. And they'll not have the reputation of a true prophet in power. Samuel is a shield against those warlike neighboring countries. Without him, Israel will be vulnerable. I can see why they might want a king to replace that shield. Honestly, though, it's much easier for me to identify with Samuel, being called into a meeting he knows nothing about, blindsided by politics. It's easy for me to understand why he's so upset. It's so easy for me to see why Samuel might take it personally, and God understands that too. But God also helps Samuel see the big picture. The elders aren't rejecting Samuel. Not really. They're rejecting God. Earlier, I said that before there was a king, a leader would sort of arise and take charge when neighboring countries went to war with the tribes of Israel. But that's not strictly true. Sometimes, when things seem to just sort of happen, God is there working in the background. I'm quite sure that is what happened with the rise and fall of the leaders we call judges. So when the elders say, we want a king, what they are saying is that they do not trust God to shield Israel and provide them with judges and prophets when the need arises. Also, you'll notice that the elders say that they want the king to govern us and go out before us and fight our battles. No mention of faith or wisdom or righteousness or justice. The elders have lost sight of the big picture. What happens next always reminds me of a wonderful metaphor someone dear to me once used for our relationship with God as it appears in the Hebrew Scriptures. It's the expanded version of one you're probably familiar with, God as parent. It goes something like this. Adam and Eve were like infants or toddlers. And so we find God saying things like, don't eat that, and put on your clothes. The other protagonists of Genesis are like small children. And so we find God saying things like, don't do the thing or I will spank you. And do the thing and I promise I'll give you a cookie. The Hebrew people in Exodus are like older children, like 10-year-olds, maybe. They might have just spent a week with like 15 10-year-old boys. And so we find God saying things like, don't do the thing. Don't do the thing. You know better. Don't do the thing. Are you even listening? Don't do the thing. I am going to kill you if you don't stop doing the thing. If it weren't for Moses, that would have been the end of the story right there. But here God says, okay, calm down. Warn them that having a king isn't really what they want. But if they insist on trying it out, let them. To me, that sounds like a tactic you take with a middle school student. Maybe a 13-year-old. Now, sometimes a 13-year-old will absorb the wisdom of an adult's experience and apply it to their lives. But sometimes, you know this is true, sometimes they just gotta try it out themselves, don't they? And that's exactly what Samuel does. He goes back to the elders and tells them exactly what it'll be like to have a king. He will take your sons to be soldiers in his army, and to plow his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make his weapons. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards. He will take your male and female slaves. And I always wince when I say that, because we don't believe that it's good to have any slaves anymore. But he'll take them, and he'll take the best of your cattle and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. In other words, you aren't going to like it. And when you realize that, God is going to say, I told you so. And God will not save you from your king. And the elders all said, yeah, but no, we want a king. Gimme. And God said, all right, if you insist. And Samuel sent them home. And here is where we pause our story. If you want to know what happens next, you'll have to come back next week. Until then, maybe we should all stop and think about what we might be able to learn from this. Have you ever really wanted something you shouldn't have wanted? Have you ever insisted on learning something the hard way? Have you ever looked back on a moment in your life and thought, in the words of Terry Pratchett, wow, I was a real twerp. I know I have. So here's the really tough question. How can we keep from behaving that way in the future? Just something to think about. What do you say?